I feel like there's so much energy in the room today, in the church today. Some of it is because the furniture has been rearranged, and so there's kind of like, oh wait, that used to be there, and so it's created this energy, and some of it is because we've started differently, and some of it's probably my own nervous energy, but there's so much energy, and so I am hoping that some of that energy actually translates to what I said before, which is not only that you would exchange names with one another, but that you would exchange phone numbers, that you would exchange contact information so that you can begin or continue to connect with one another. And the reason, and we as a church have been trying to figure out how it is that we can connect with each other. And so we've been I've been asking you, invite somebody to a meal or to a walk or something. And special for today only, if you do exchange a phone number with someone, I'm going to say that counts as an invitation. And so you get to participate in our knot rope wall that's over there, our knotted rope hanging that's over there. If you're looking at that and you're like, I don't know what that is, like, what am I supposed to do with that? That is sort of our physical representation of the connections that we are trying to make in our congregation, the connections with each other. And so what we've invited people to do is that as you engage with one another during the week, as you go for coffee or a walk or whatever it is that you do, play basketball, doesn't matter, have a phone call on the phone. We've invited people to sort of go over to the wall hanging on a Sunday morning and take two ropes that are next to each other and tie a knot. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. It can be like over around the tree, look through the loop, pull tight and see, like really simple knot. But it just kind of is a visual way for us to see how there are connections that are happening in our congregation between us. And I'm hoping that as more knots are tied, it will encourage more of us to tie knots. It will encourage more of us to reach out to each other and engage in relationships with one another. So if this is your first day, you also are invited to participate. You don't have to be like, I have to come for 6 months first. No, like you can participate today, even if you're never coming back. You can participate today. So please make sure that you sort of extend an invitation to somebody that you tie a knot to represent, and so we can encourage one another in continuing engaging in this community. Now, this is our third week in our series called Promised. And so it's been a series about looking at the promise that was given to Abraham and then handed down to his descendants, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph in the book of Genesis. Now, these four characters are these biblical characters that are sort of a reflection of all of us. They were given this special role to participate in God's mission in redeeming and restoring the whole world, just like we have been invited to participate in that. Just like we have a unique role in God's mission in the world. But they, just like us, sort of wrestled with this like faithfulness and unfaithfulness kind of decisions that they made. They really wanted to trust God, but often they did just the opposite. So far we've looked at how God promised Abraham that he and his family had this unique role to play in God's mission to redeem and restore the world after sin steeped into the world and it was just utterly broken. However, when things didn't move as fast for Abraham as he really wanted them to be, as he really thought that it would be, Abraham sort of stepped in and he took matters into his own hands. And the result didn't negate God's promise for Abraham, but it did create a lot of pain and a lot of heartache for both Abraham and those around him. See, when God promises something, he always makes it happen. We just have to wait, but by force-fitting our own solutions, we can cause a lot of pain to the people around us. But sometimes in situations, we think we know better than God. We think that we could do it better than God. We think that it could make it happen, and we trust ourselves more than God. And this narrative reminds us to trust God in every moment for the blessing that he promised. And then last week, we looked at how Abraham's child, Isaac, who was past the blessing, has two children, Jacob and Esau, and they're these twins. So for Abraham, there was this epic problem in that there was no son to pass the blessing to. But in our story last week, there was this epic problem of there's two sons to pass the blessing to. Who is going to be the one that is blessed? Who's going to be the one who is going to not only be Isaac's favorite, but God's favorite? Who's the one that will get to be a part of God's plan to redeem and restore the world? And all of that got signified by who was blessed. And so the jockeying for position between Isaac and Jacob began very early on. It began between them, and it began between their parents, each of them trying to do whatever they could to secure the blessing of being the favored, of being the important one, of being the one who was most loved, who was better than the other. And ultimately, Jacob, led by his mom, Rebekah, manipulates and deceives his father, Isaac, into giving him the blessing. But what Jacob didn't understand is that the blessing of being the favored one, being a part of God's mission to redeem and restore the world, was his from the very beginning. He just kept looking for it in the wrong places, and he thought that he needed to be somebody different than he was in order to get the blessing. But this blessing is the blessing that belongs to each one of us too. Because of Christ, we are all the firstborn. We've all been given the blessing of being the favorite one, of being the most important child, the child that gets all of the attention, the child that gets the extra because of Christ. We get all that has been promised. Now, this story is going to continue. But before I jump into how it continues, I want you to turn to the person next to you, and I just want you to really briefly share with them, what is a doubt that you have always had, or you have had at some point in your life? What is a doubt about God, about somebody else, about the church, about spirituality, about the fact that a roller coaster really will get you there safely? Whatever your doubt is, turn to the person next to you and just share. What's your doubt? Go. And you're done. Hope nobody hogged the conversation. The other person didn't get to share. If you did, shame on you. Now, if you have ever doubted, if you've ever wrestled with God, if you've ever had doubts about who God is, if you've ever questioned, God, what the heck are you doing in my life? This story is for you. And if you have ever held on to something for years, maybe it was a grudge, maybe it was a fear or a belief that if only you accomplished the next level of something, if only you got the next promotion, if only you arrived in whatever sort of way you were holding on to, then you would be accepted, then you would be enough. Then this story is for you, because that's exactly what's going on with Jacob in this story. Now, after Jacob deceived his father and sort of stole the blessing, the dysfunction of their family got worse and worse. You'd think it'd get better, but it didn't. It only got worse. His brother Esau, whose name means red, was so angry with Jacob. So angry with Jacob, he wanted to kill him. He said, I'm going to wait till my father dies, but as soon as my father dies, which could be any day now, I'm going to kill you. And so if he wasn't red before, he was red hot with hatred towards Jacob then. And that wasn't the only way that this family continued to become more and more dysfunctional. Jacob, this whole time, the whole reason he did this was to try to get the attention and acceptance and love of his father. But instead of that drawing him close to his father, it actually just severed the relationship even more. They became even more disconnected and distant for each other. And so Jacob was sent away from his family with just the clothes on his back. Rebekah organized something so that he could go back to the homeland, the place that she came from, to live with her brother Laban. Now, he left and he arrived in the place where Laban lived. But you would think that a man who had been given this blessing of being highly favored by God, that That you think this person who had been promised that he would be a part of this epic purpose and role of redeeming and restoring the whole world, that you would think he would understand that he was worthy in the eyes of God. That he would live this life that reflected that he would no longer worry, that he would no longer strive, that he would no longer struggle, that he would no longer manipulate all the people around him. You'd think that he would just live in freedom, but it doesn't. You'd think that he'd have gratitude towards God his whole life, that he wouldn't pretend to be somebody that he's not anymore, that he would live with no fear and no deceit. But that's not what he did. You'd think that if even a thief who was super deceitful had an experience like that with God, that when he would go to a new place and a new land, that he would recognize that this was like a fresh slate, a clean slate for him, and he would start as a new person. But he didn't. Instead, Jacob goes to live with Laban, and he lives this life of like scheming and plotting and deception at every turn. He's always trying to get ahead. And even though he was promised this blessing, he's still trying to accumulate as much wealth and possessions as he possibly can. He's trying to get as many wives as he can. He's trying to get as many children as he can, even if it means being deceitful and being manipulative. And if you thought that the biblical characters were something to exemplify, Jacob's not one of them. You don't want to live like him. And you can tell as you read chapters 28 through 32 that Jacob sort of continuously is trying to protect himself. He's continuously trying to prove himself, to get ahead, as if the whole promise of this whole promised thing depends on him and him alone to secure this promise. And all of this manipulation and deceit made Jacob incredibly rich and wealthy with a lot of wives and a lot of sons. But it also made him some serious enemies that weren't so happy with him. And so it came to time about 20 years later where Jacob has to leave. Jacob has to go away because everyone hates him. Even his uncle, Laban, and his family. And so 20 years go by, and Jacob is visited by God in this dream. And God tells Jacob that it's time to go back home. It's time to go back to his family. It's time to go see Esau again. And so Jacob gathers up his belongings, his herds and his flocks, his servants and his wives and his children. He gathers all of this up and he begins to journey home. Now, here's the thing. For Jacob, with this dysfunctional family in his past, there's no Facebook where he can look up the different characters and see what has been going on. There's no creeping on them and finding out, ooh, that looks like a bitter post. You might still be bitter. He can't do any of those things, so he kind of just has to walk into this situation blindly, hoping that God has prepared the way for him, praying that things are going to be different, but ultimately he has no idea what's in store for him as he goes back to this family that he's taken advantage of and he's stolen from. And so while Jacob is on his long journey back home, he sends some messengers ahead of him to find his brother Esau. And this is what he instructs them to do. He tells them, this is what you are to say to my lord Esau. Now notice, it's not, this is what you're to say to my swindling brother who hates me. This is what you're to say to my lord. Esau is elevated to a lord. That's where his heart and his mind is. This is what you say to my lord Esau. Your servant Jacob says, your servant, Jacob's lowering himself and humbling himself as a servant. Your servant Jacob says, I have been staying with Laban and have remained there until now. I have cattle and donkeys and sheep and goats, male and female servants. He's like, I got all this stuff. And now I'm sending this message to my Lord that I might find favor in your eyes. Now, what Jacob's doing is he's trying to test the waters. This is his version of Facebook creeping. How's everything going over there? And here's what we're told. When the messengers returned to Jacob, they said, we went to your brother Esau, and now he's coming to meet you, and 400 men are with him. Now, this could be good, but probably not. This is probably really bad. if your brother is coming with 400 men and he wanted to kill you before, your conclusion is, he's definitely going to kill me now. And Jacob is terrified. He's terrified. And so he begins to scheme and calculate how is he going to intercept his brother? How is he going to meet with him? Remember, Jacob has never done like a non-manipulative thing in his life. He's never made an uncalculated decision. And so here in this space right now where his death is approaching him, he's once again manipulating and calculating to try to figure out, how can I maintain the blessing? How can I maintain the favored life? And so what we're told is that Jacob, with great fear and distress, divided the people who were with him into two groups, and the flocks and herds and camels as well. Now, there's two reasons we're told that he divides them into two groups. The first one, we're told, is so that if Esau and his men attack the first group, the second group has a chance to get away. And then we're told that Jacob's going to hang way, way, way back so he can certainly get away. And then the other thing that we're told, the second reason that he divides them into these groupings, and by the way, in the first group, it breaks it down later. In the first group, he puts like his least favorite wife and his least favorite children. In the second group, it's like, hang towards the back, my favorite wife and favorite children. He's a great guy. He didn't learn anything from his time. Anyways. The second reason that we're told that he puts them in these groupings is because there's a certain number of goats and sheep and camels and cows and donkeys that are earmarked as gifts for Esau. Jacob's sort of hoping that as this caravan of people and animals approach Esau, that they'll kind of present and say, and this is for you, and this is for you. And Esau will have this thing in his heart that says, wait, there's more? Oh, there's more? Oh, more. His hope is that this whole thing will kind of butter Esau up. It'll soften his heart and sort of win him over. And so Jacob tells the servants who are taking these gifts to Esau, he says, as each gift approach, you're to say, they belong to your servant Jacob. They are a gift sent to my lord Esau. And he's coming behind us. And these two phrases, your servant Jacob and my lord Esau, are repeated again and again. Each group, Jacob says, please make sure you remember my lord Esau and your servant Jacob. Remember to say that. And all of it is this calculated step to try to get Esau to be broken down, to try to get Esau to not fight, to try to have Jacob continue to secure this blessing. So Jacob sends all of the gifts and the family ahead, but he stays back to spend one more night at the camp alone. And I imagine him kind of listening in the distance. Do I hear screams of murder and massacre? No? Okay, we're still good. At least Jacob thought that he was alone. But then all of a sudden, in the darkness, a man jumps out of nowhere and begins to wrestle with Jacob. In the text, we're given no more information than this. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. Now, this is a really strange thing. And until later, we don't find out who this man is. But if you're Jacob, and there's this sort of major pending conflict with your brother who you haven't seen for years and wanted to kill you the last time you saw him, if somebody jumps out of the darkness and starts wrestling you, chances are you think it's your brother. Chances are you think that the person who's shrouded in darkness is your brother, the person you've had conflict with, and chances are Jacob thought that this man was Esau. He thought that it was the person that he most feared, the person that was the source of all of his problems. Now, we aren't told that in the text. We aren't told that Jacob thinks that. But it would have been plausible for Jacob to initially conclude that in the darkness, this man is Esau. And then we're told that this man and Jacob continue to wrestle together till daybreak, which basically means that they were evenly matched. Like if one person is stronger than the other person, then the other person just takes them out. But if they've continued to wrestle all night long, there's this evenly matched sort of peace. They're both strong. There's a point for Jacob and a point for the man, and a point for Jacob and a point for the man, and a point for Jacob and a point for the man. Now, these are the best games. There's a Super Bowl a couple years ago where one of the teams, I think it was the Denver Broncos, they didn't even show up. They didn't score a single point. And it was the worst game in the world because I think it was the Patriots. They just mopped the field with them. There was nothing that happened. This is the one sports game of the year that I watch. And it's because I watch it surrounded by all of my favorite food. But I just remember this one Super Bowl where the other team didn't even show up. They just got creamed. Those aren't fun games to watch. It's the games where the teams are evenly matched, where you don't actually know who is going to win. At any time, one could take the lead or the other could come back. And that's what this was, all night long. And Jacob doesn't give up. Jacob thinks he has a chance to take him because they're evenly matched. But then all of a sudden, this thing happens. This man, we're told that this man reaches out and touches, not grabs, not punches, not wrenches, not pinches, but literally touches Jacob's hip. And his entire hip comes out of socket. It's ruined. Forever, we're told. It's ruined. And I wonder if in that moment, Jacob sort of thought, Esau doesn't have that power. I don't think this is Esau. This is someone so different. I thought Esau was my problem, but it turns out that I'm wrestling with something so much bigger than this. And we're told that when the man reaches out and touches Jacob and dislocates his hip, in that moment, the man says, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." And Jacob replies, "I will not let you go until you bless me." We see this image of Jacob still wrestling for the blessing. And the man asked him, "What is your name?" And Jacob answered, "Jacob," he answered. And then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." And Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" This is kind of a statement saying, "Don't you know who I am?" And then he blessed him there. So Jacob called this place Peniel, saying, "It's because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." And it's in this moment that Jacob and us as the reader realize that this man was not Esau, this man was God. This God-man comes and wrestles with Jacob. And there's so many questions about what that means and how did that happen. But we're told he's wrestling with God. And although he's doing it physically in this moment, Jacob's been wrestling with God his whole life. All the striving, all the struggle, all the proving. He thought that he was wrestling with his brother and his family. But none of it was about Esau. It was always about God. The whole time he had been fighting God. And the craziest part is that God actually let him. God actually comes to him in a form where they are evenly matched. And God let Jacob wrestle him. He let him strive and struggle. God lets him do this all night long. Now, at some point, all of us have come to these places where we find ourselves sort of wrestling with God. Sometimes it takes the form of wrestling with what he is doing in our lives. We think that our lives should go one way, and God is taking them a completely different way. And so we are wrestling with God saying, "No, this isn't how it's supposed to happen. This isn't how it was supposed to go. I wanted something different." Other times, the form of wrestling with God comes in the form of wrestling with our doubts. Doubts that we have about God, doubts that we have about the church, about spirituality, about theological concepts, about people in our lives. Now, in some churches and in some faith communities, you aren't allowed to express the ways that you've been wrestling with God. That there's this idea That whether your doubts or your wrestlings manifest in your doubts about God or faith or anger and grief and questioning about the events that are taking place in your life, you're not allowed to speak them. You're not allowed to say them. There's sort of this idea that in those places that to doubt or question God sort of is like you having a lack of faith, that you are weak, that you don't really trust God. And that's really not an awesome place to live in because in cultures and families and churches where you can't express your doubts or your uncertainties or your questions, they tend to create greater skeptics. And they tend to create sort of apathetic people too. If you can't voice your struggles, if you have to keep burying them down, you can never get answers. And you kind of give up sort of this resistance. You just sort of stop seeking, and you stop trying, and you stop wrestling. Sometimes that looks like just leaving the church and saying, you know what, like none of it makes sense. No one will let me ask questions, so I'm out. Peace. Other times it actually looks like staying in the pews and just letting whatever is said wash over you and be like, Have you ever been in a relationship where like, okay, so this is really unfair to the men in this room. But like when somebody's mansplaining you, okay, so only my generation and females are laughing at that. So maybe you don't know what that is. It's basically when typically a man, I apologize, women get stereotyped too, but like typically a man is like telling you blah, 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 and you know, and you're like, whatever, I'm not gonna listen to you anyways. So you just do this thing and you're like, oh yeah, And then you leave and you're like, I'm not doing any of that, you're dumb. Sometimes when we're not allowed to wrestle with God or we've given up wrestling with God, we hear God's truth come to us and we're like, yeah, that's good. And they're like, ugh, shut up. Like, I don't care, right? And we just allow the truth of God to bypass us and blow through us, and it doesn't make a difference because we're not going to change. We're not going to take it to heart. We're not going to engage it. We're not really going to grow. We're not going to wrestle with it. And those are terrible places to be. But God is big enough for us to wrestle with him, to struggle with him, to ask him the big questions, to basically say, hey, I doubt all of this stuff. None of this makes any sense to me right now. God is big enough for us to come before him and say, hey, I thought you promised this, but this other thing is happening and it's ticking me off and throwing me for a loop, and I don't know if I can even trust you anymore. God is big enough for us to doubt him and to wrestle with him. That's not a bad thing. It means that we haven't given up. It means that we're willing to engage God even as we wrestle with our own questions and our own doubts and the brokenness of this world. And this is what Jacob does all night long. But he's been doing it his whole life. And when God cries uncle at daybreak and says, let me go, and Jacob's like, I can't let you go until you bless me. Jacob is still craving to be blessed. He's had this craving his whole life. And no matter what he does, no matter how many wives he has, no matter how many cattle and possessions and money, it never fulfills it. But this time he knows that he is holding on to something so powerful and so great and so big. He's like, this must be God and this must satisfy. So he won't let go until he's blessed. And in this moment, God reveals Jacob's true identity. His identity that's been there the whole time, it's just been hiding. And in this wrestling, God reveals it to him. He says, your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have wrestled, you have struggled with God and with human beings and have overcome. Then he blessed him. And it's here that the entire family of Abraham takes on their new name, the nation of Israel, the nation that struggles with God. It's not the nation that is perfect. It's not the nation that has all the answers. It's the nation that struggles and wrestles with God. See, our wrestling and our struggling with God isn't a bad thing. Instead, it's the very thing that draws us closer to God. It reveals our identity and our purpose and our future. It brings vibrancy and life to our relationship with him. Now, for me, I love this story because I see myself in it. I see myself as Jacob. It helps me name what's been happening in my life for the past 3 years, this 3-year journey that I've been on with God. And if you know my history, that's the length of time, doesn't take a lot of math, that's the length of time that I've been here at Clarksburg Church. See, when I came here, there was something in me that was also confirmed by others. That this church was sort of primed to witness the expansion of the kingdom of God. There was sort of this promise that I felt like I was given and was confirmed by others, that this church was going to have a role in bringing the kingdom of heaven to earth in this place, in sort of the Up County area. And so with these sort of eager expectations and because of this promise that I was going to be a part of God's mission to redeem and restore the world via Clarksburg Church, my family and I moved here. And I came to Clarksburg Church wide-eyed and expectant to witness this sort of massive harvest. And I don't mean just like numerical growth, but maturity of people that were passionately pursuing a relationship with God that resulted in like discipling other people and mentoring others. That neighbors and coworkers of the people that met in this room would like rise up and desire to follow Christ as a result of what was happening in this place. That the entire city of Clarksburg and the surrounding areas would like be better because this church was here sitting on 22820 Frederick Road, because of the people that would gather in this place on a Sunday morning would be so impassioned and revitalized and brought to life by who Christ is, that they would go to all of these places and bring the light of Christ. And that's slowly happening. There's some of that happening. I don't want to downplay that. But I didn't anticipate the wrestling. I didn't anticipate the wrestling match that would accompany all of this. I didn't anticipate the frustration with the slow pace of the work. I didn't anticipate the unforeseen obstacles or the doubt that would surface in my own life about my capabilities, about God's capabilities, about God's faithfulness. And honestly, asking the question almost every day, am I really the one that's supposed to be doing this? Am I really the person for this job? I have these questions that I bring to God and I say, are you really going to show up? Are you really going to show up with the people? Are you really going to show up with the volunteers? Are you really going to show up with the money? Are you really going to show up with the truth? Are you really going to show up for my family? And always the ever-present question, God, why aren't you working faster? Why aren't you showing up in the way that I have predicted and hoped that you would come? There's been so much wrestling with God that has happened behind the scenes for me over the past 3 years. And I have cried out and shouted out and wrestled with God more than I care to admit. But through all of this wrestling, I stand before you and I can say that I am closer to my Heavenly Father. I am more secure in the identity that He has for me. I have more clarity about my role and our role in this mission to redeem and restore this world that He has created. And I wouldn't trade that connection and that blessing that I have with my God for an easy road. It's this wrestling that has made me come alive. It has brought me this relentless hope and this welling up joy and this driven purpose. Now, for some of you, maybe you can relate to this. Maybe there's something in your life that you have just been wrestling with. all night long, wrestling with all year, all decades, all your lifetime, wrestling with God. But through that wrestling, God has become real because you can push against him. You can feel him push against you. For others, this is a far cry from where you've been. You stopped wrestling with God long ago. You got tired. You gave up. You either turned a cold shoulder to your relationship with God and you're really only here because someone's dragging you here, or you really like our free coffee. Or you've become sort of this reed in the wind that just lets the truth of God blow past you, but not transform you, not bring life to you. You hear this stuff about God and you're like, yeah, that's true, but you don't engage it. You don't wrestle with it. You just let it blow past you unaffected. Now, for both groups, I want to encourage you. Go wrestle with God. Ask the questions. Press in. Open your Bibles and allow God to speak to you. Spend the morning in fasting and prayer. Don't relent. Jacob is this perfect picture of what we are called to do as people who wrestle with God. In that moment, he's holding on to God and he's tired and he's sweating and he's bloody from the night's battle. And he's crying out and he just says, I'm not going to let go of you till you bless me. He doesn't know how to do anything except hold on and say, I'm not going to let go. See, the people who find God are the people who every day, like they sit down every day or as often as they can, and they say, I'm going to pray. I don't know how to pray, but I'm going to do it. I've read a book and I still don't know how to do it. I talked to Beth and I still don't know how to do it, but I'm going to sit down and I'm going to pray. And I'm not going to leave this space until you bless me. I won't stop until you show me my value and my worth and my importance and my role in this world. I'm going to pray because I can't get it anywhere else. There's nowhere else I can go. There's nothing else that satisfies. Nothing else can offer me the blessing. And so I'm going to hold on to this thing until you bless me. And another way you can do this is by being obedient. Obeying even when it doesn't make sense, even when it's not convenient, even when it seems impractical. That's another way to hold on, to just keep saying, I'm going to keep being obedient until you bless me. I want the blessing. I'm here and I'm not letting go. Please come to me. I'm holding on to you to bring this deeper relationship between me and you, God, and this greater clarity about who I am and who you've made me to be. Now, for Jacob, he was utterly changed after this experience. We're told that he meets up with Esau, and he's not afraid at all. And the reason he's not afraid is because when you've seen the face of God, when you've wrestled with God, when you know your value and your worth and your importance and identity as defined by God, you're not afraid of anything. Now, in the story of Jacob wrestling with God, not only is God big enough to let us wrestle with him, God is actually big enough to bring Jacob to his knees with merely a touch. He wrestles with Jacob all night long, but at daybreak, God simply touches Jacob's hip, and it goes out of socket, and he's brought to his knees. It sounds so vindictive when you think about it that way, but it's actually this great grace of someone who loves you but knows better than you. That God shows incredible strength and power that he has, but the whole night he reserved it. Like, what's the deal with that? See, God came to Jacob in the same way that Jesus comes to us. If God had come in that moment with all of his power, he would have won the battle instantaneously, but he would have destroyed Jacob. In the same way, if Jesus had come to earth with all of his power and wiped out all of evil in the blink of an eye, he would have won the battle, but all of us would have been destroyed. But Jesus Christ came like God came to Jacob in weakness, limiting himself, allowing himself to be vulnerable and human. allowing himself to be killed on a cross. By surrendering himself to death, he saved us. And by surrendering our lives to Jesus, we win. In the same way that there are many areas of culture that wrongly disallow doubt and questioning, there are more areas of culture that are sort of rising up that say, hey, anyone who's surrendered to God, anyone who has any certainty about God or belief or faith, they're viewed as sort of this naive and unthinking person. How could you surrender to God? That seems so foolish. How could you believe in God? What a silly thing to do. They've sort of turned doubt and questioning and wrestling into a virtue. But the result is that they get stuck in their doubts and their wrestling, and they never move beyond that. They never surrender. And so while we are called to surrender with this big God, he also wants to bring us to, while we're called to wrestle with this big God, he also wants to bring us to this place of surrender. For Jacob, when God unleashes his power at just the right moment, it helps him stop wrestling and striving, and it lets him rest in some sort of certainty that this being is bigger and more powerful than him, that God is going to alter the course of his life. And like Jacob, in the midst of our wrestling, we need to come to a place where we can acknowledge that God is big and powerful and mighty and holy, and that we're completely dependent on him. We need this type of surrender in our lives also. We need to wrestle with a God that's big enough to struggle with, but then surrender to a God that's big enough to rest in. And that's why this morning we're going to respond in these ways, in both wrestling and in surrender. In just a few minutes, the band is going to come up and they're going to play, but there won't be any lyrics because I want you to focus on your conversation with God, what you need to say to him and what he is trying to say to you. And I'm going to ask you to participate in two different stations. If you're in the back 3 rows, you are going to you're going to go engage the station with the clay on it. That's going to be our wrestling station. You're going to go there first. And at each of those tables, there's instructions about what you're going to do in case you forget, so you don't have to oh no, write this down, you'll be okay. But you're going to go to those wrestling stations, and there are these small lumps of clay on the table, and you're going to wrestle with the clay. Is it hard? Is it soft? Is it willing? Is it unwilling to be formed? And as you wrestle with the clay, I simply want you to allow God to speak to you about the identity that he has given you and he's forming in you. As God prompts you, I want you to form the clay into who God is making you to be, what he's trying to tell you about himself. And when you're done, there are baby wipes over there, and you can wash your hands with them. But if you have time, you're going to move to the next station, and that's the station that the other group of people had started out. So the front 2 rows are going to go there. You're going to start out over at these tables, and there's these little scraps of paper. And on these pieces of paper, you're going to write the thing that you've been holding on to. That's not God. The thing you've been holding on to, hoping that it will bring you blessing, belonging, acceptance, enoughness, safety, importance. Maybe it's a need to please others, or a fear, or a behavior, or addiction. Then you're going to, once you've got that down on your piece of paper, you're going to take that to the cross, and you're going to hold it in your fist, and you're going to hold your hands in the air. And there's a prayer that you're going to read silently in your head. And when you're ready, you're going to open up your hands in the international sign of surrender, as your way of symbolically saying, God, I surrender this to you. I've let go of that. I'm not holding on to it anymore. I surrender to you. And if you have time, you can then move to the other station, and then we'll sing together. Let's begin of this time of response with prayer. Will you pray with me? Father God, we are here for a conversation with you. You have spoken us truth through your word. You have begun to stir things in our heart about the ways that we have wrestled with you or we've just given up. You have begun to call us to a place of surrender. May we not be people who manipulate and struggle and strive to bless ourselves, but may we be people who respond to you. We thank you for Jesus, who allows us to have this relationship with you. And now would you speak to us? We pray all of these things in your holy and precious name. Amen.